Ashira Unger. Welcome back to the Kosher Convert. Most people I meet have never tried Finnish food. Now, that's not entirely surprising because there are fewer Finns in the world than there are Jews. It's a little bit of an obscure cuisine and people don't really seek it out, but my mom's from Finland and so I grew up with a lot of Finnish cooking and I love it. It's a little bit of an interesting cuisine. There's a lot of dairy. If you look at a traditional cookbook, the rice is boiled in milk, the meat is boiled in milk, and even the bread is made with milk. So if you want to make something that you can serve at a fleishik meal, you have to do a lot of substituting. One of the quintessential Finnish dishes is something called Pulla. Now, Pulla is a braided coffee bread that looks an awful lot like challah. Since Rosh Hashanah is coming up and it's traditional to serve sweet challahs, I thought this would be the perfect time to introduce Pulla. What you'll need is 8 cups of flour, 2 cups of almond milk, 3½ teaspoons of yeast, 1/4 cup of water, 4 eggs, a cup of sugar, 1 stick, which is ½ a cup of a non-dairy butter substitute like Earth Balance. Again, I always say don't use margarine because of the trans fat, so this is 1 stick of Earth Balance, ½ a cup of raisins, 2 teaspoons of cardamom. Now, in order to get the most authentic flavor, it's really important that you don't use ground cardamom. If you have to and that's all you have, fine. But ideally what the recipe needs is something called crushed cardamom. Now, you can't actually get that if you live in America, so you need to get the whole cardamom pods and then crush them with a mortar and pestle or a Ziploc baggie and a hammer, which I have done plenty of times. And so again, if you absolutely have to use the ground, it's okay, but if you want the most authentic, real flavor, you need to get whole pods and crush them. So it's about 40 pods, which will give you about 2 teaspoons of cardamom, and finally 2 teaspoons of salt. The first step is to proof the yeast. Now, that 1/4 cup of water that I mentioned should be warm, probably about 120 to 140 degrees. You don't want it to be too hot because water that's really hot will kill the yeast, but you want to kind of wake the yeast up and make sure that it's alive. So take your water, make sure that it's warm but not too hot, add that in, and then take a teaspoon of sugar. Now, this is a teaspoon in addition to that 1 cup that I mentioned at the beginning. And that's kind of like food for the yeast. And so it's going to wake it up and it's going to start to bubble and get active. Just mix all of that together. Now, yeast don't like oxygen. So just cover that to kind of keep out the oxygen, or to, lessen it, and just set that aside and let it sit for about 10 minutes and it should start to get puffy. And while that's sitting, you can go ahead and take the eggs and the margarine. At this point, melt down the margarine because we're almost ready to combine everything, and just give the eggs a little bit of a light whisking just to break up the yolks a little bit. So once your eggs are beaten a little bit, your margarine is melted, we can go ahead and start combining. Okay, so start by putting everything except the flour and the yeast mixture into a large bowl. Just mix until that's well combined. And the biggest thing that you're trying to incorporate here is just until you feel that sugar entirely dissolved. Okay, and once it's pretty well combined, start adding some flour, a little bit at a time, and we're probably going to add about half of the flour at this point. It's not even a dough yet, it's really just kind of a watery mess. But the more flour you add, the more it's going to start to come together. But if you add it all at once, then it's just going to be clumpy. So I feel like it's much easier to add a little bit at a time. Okay, and once your dough sort of looks like this, it's a little bit sticky, it's kind of coming together a little bit. It's about half the flour. At this point, we're going to add the yeast mixture. So just take your yeast that's been sitting, it should be nice and beautiful and foamy at this point. Go ahead and add that at this point. Okay, and then we're gradually going to add all of the rest of the flour. Not all at once. And once it starts to get really sticky like this, it might feel easier to actually mix it by just sticking your hand in, which is totally fine. Okay, and at this point, once you can see that you've gotten all that flour incorporated, it's time to turn it out onto a board and start kneading it. I like to use these silicone mats. And I also like to have a little extra flour close by, because if it's a little too sticky and you feel like you need to work in a little more flour, this is the perfect time. So just kind of start working the dough. Finnish recipes are kind of funny. If you look at a traditional Finnish cookbook, or a traditional recipe before there were cookbooks, they don't really have amounts or temperatures or anything like that. It's sort of, add enough of this ingredient, add enough of that ingredient until it feels right. Cook it in a medium oven until done. And it's kind of the way a lot of them go. So with this, basically it's that kind of a deal. You add a little bit of flour, keep adding until it feels right. And it should look something like this. It's not really sticky anymore, but it's a nice dough. And at this point, it's going to be time to let it rise. Because I did have more than 8 cups, I do need to separate challah from this, but it's not enough to say the bracha, so it's just the separating of challah. So once you do that, if you're making this amount, then put it in a lightly greased bowl, cover it, and let it sit for about an hour until it's doubled in bulk. Okay, so it's been about an hour. The dough has risen, and so now we are just going to braid that and shape it. So punch it down and just turn it out onto your mat again. The first step is going to be just to knead it a little bit more. Once you finish kneading, then it's time to shape it. The most traditional shape for Pulla in Finland is a 3-stranded braid. All you do is roll out the strands and then braid them together. And just pinch the end, tuck it under. And you can kind of shape it and kind of push it to get it to be the right shape. And then put that on your prepared baking pan. I always line my baking pans with parchment first. Cover it while you're preparing the other one so it doesn't dry out. Okay, so I'll make this one round just for anybody who's never made a round challah and you want to learn how to kind of shape that. Okay, simple round loaf. You have 2 strands parallel, and the other 2 strands are parallel over them. So it sort of forms a box in the middle. But then you want to layer these so that in each pair, the one on the left is underneath. So here it's underneath, here it's underneath. So you want this one to be underneath. And that way you have sort of a crisscross where they're under, over, under, over, under, over, under, over. And then you just take the one that's underneath in each pair, lift it over the partner, and then you just do it in the other direction with the one that's now underneath. So you just go the other direction. And then you do it again in the other direction. This is why you want long strands. And then maybe I can fit one more. The guy that's underneath always goes over. Okay, then you pinch the dough at each little joint. Just squish it together. And then you bring all of those 4 pinches that you just made up into the center, squish that together, turn the whole thing over, and you have a nice little round challah. Put that on the baking sheet with the other one. And cover and let those sit in a warm place until they've risen also about an hour. So you can see how nicely the loaves have risen. They're probably about double of what they were before. And now the last step is going to be just to brush them with an egg wash and sprinkle with sugar. Okay, then we just bake in a 350-degree oven for about 35 to 40 minutes. So this is the pulla. Look a little familiar? It kind of feels like a Finnish spin on challah. And it's really meant to be a coffee bread, but it's versatile. You can use it as a dessert. It could be challah for, Rosh Hashanah, and the leftovers make amazing French toast. As always, recipes and other information will be on our website, and you can find us on our Facebook page. Shana tova umetuka.